You're listening to episode 15 of A Whole New You podcast. On today's show, we're talking about takeaways from the book Present Over Perfect. Welcome to A Whole New You podcast. I'm your co-host, Kim Maravich. I'm a registered nurse and author of the book 360 Health. I'm joined by my dear friend, Laurie, a health and wellness coach certified through the Institute for Integrative Nutrition. Our show exists to inspire and empower women to take charge of their health with weekly tips and conversation about self-care, mindset, nutrition, fitness, and clean living. Please keep in mind that the material provided in this podcast is intended as general information only and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's get to the show.
Today, we're talking about one of my favorite things, and I'm so excited, and I feel like I say that a lot. So again, just very glad to have this vehicle to discuss all these things that I love. But today, we're talking about a book called Present Over Perfect. And on the cover, it says, "Leaving behind frantic for a simpler, more soulful way of living." And in the author's words, for those of you that have not read it, on the inside cover, she says, "Present Over Perfect is an invitation to this journey that has changed my life. I'll walk this path with you, a path away from frantic pushing and proving and toward your essential self, the one you were created to be before you began proving and earning for your worth." So, I mean, that is just very, very profound and very, against our culture these days. So it's just such a great message. And for those of you that have read it, I had a moment last night where, it was 70 degrees here in Pittsburgh, and I was out in the driveway playing basketball with my daughter when I should have been. And when I say playing basketball, we were playing pig. And she does like crazy dance moves before she shoots, and then I have to repeat it if she makes it. It's quite ridiculous. So if you live around here, you might want to drive past on a nice day sometime and see this craziness going on in my driveway. But I really should have been inside making dinner and doing all the things that need done on a weeknight evening. But I was out in the driveway playing basketball, the very basketball hoop that was inspired by this book 2 years ago when I read it, in my white Converse that were also inspired by this book. So again, those of you who read it will have a little giggle at that. And I just thought of the irony, that in the morning I was going to be talking about this book. So just so grateful for it. And there's a couple other listeners that shared, their takeaways from reading this book. And I just think it's so powerful hearing everyone's perspective because, it's going to hit everybody in a different way. And there's so much goodness in here. It's not a very big book, but it's just packed with just so much great perspective. So, everybody kind of takes it a different way, and it different pieces resonate with different people. So here's what a couple people said. One of our listeners, who's also named Kim, but my co-host Kim's going to chime in later too about, her takeaways. But this Kim said, "We waste a lot of time and make ourselves miserable trying to be perfect. Thinking perfection is where happiness lies, when all we really need to do is be present each day, for ourselves and for the people in our lives. Enjoy everything God has blessed you with already." That is so true. That moment when, you take an inventory of your life. I just had this happen with a client last week, and it was such a cool moment. When you stop and take an inventory and you realize you already have what you need to be happy. And that's huge because we're always trying to do more and have more, and to just really stop and appreciate that God's given you what you need is a huge moment. So Veronica also sent us, some of her comments and takeaways from the book. And she says, "Being a perfectionist, as I always have been, and being aware that it is more of a drawback than a virtue, the title itself caught my attention. And also I remember a fellow yoga teacher recommended it to me a while ago. So I bought the book and read it, and it was so refreshing and funny and so profound at the same time. And it resonated with me in so many parts. It reminded me that it is not about what you achieve in life that matters, nor what other people think about you. It is about how you feel inside, about being present, open, connected, and grounded, so you can truly feel alive, grateful, and whole. And like a good friend of mine said to me on a time of big changes for her, life is not perfect, and we have to adjust and accommodate with what it is and keep going forward, welcoming whatever is to come with a good attitude, comforting and being supportive for all of your loved ones, and being capable of receiving comfort and support as well. So being present over perfect has become my new daily mantra and is going to stay with me for a while. And I love that people shared, some of their stories about this book. And I have a big story, because I can say, honestly, this book has changed my life. I read it a few years ago, and I think a big part of it was that I was just at a point in my life where I needed to hear this message so badly, and timing is truly everything. So I have a quote on my vision board that reminds me where I was then and how far I've come. And the quote says, "In my blind need to be seen as a hyper-capable, ultra-dependable, that girl who can handle anything, I've built a life I can no longer handle. My to-do list ran me like an unkind taskmaster." And I think the reason that quote hit me so hard is because shortly before reading this book and reading this page, I had my moment. I was laying on my bed, covered in a sea of to-do lists. I had one for my corporate job as a financial analyst, one for my volunteer activities, one for my home and kids stuff and all that I needed to remember for that, one for the holidays, and one for an upcoming trip for Thanksgiving. I seriously lost it. And I was too paralyzed by how much needed done that I couldn't do any of it. I was always a list person. Like, as long as I can remember, I've been a list person, and it served me very well for a very long time, until I piled too much on my plate that even my organizational skills couldn't save me. So I was exhausted and I was miserable. And what I realized was that so much of it was just expectations that I was putting on myself. And everything that I was supposedly doing for my family was ultimately a disservice to them. So another quote from the book that totally resonated with me is, "I hope you live a life you're proud of. If you find that you are not, I hope you have the strength to start all over again." And that's an original quote from Scott Fitzgerald. And I think it was, in the beginning of one of the chapters, there's a quote at the beginning of every chapter, and that was at one of them. And it just hit me so hard. And I totally did that. And you guys have heard pieces of this, in previous podcast episodes. But one of my friends termed it Laurie 2.0, and I just love that. So now I'm doing something that I'm very passionate about and finding joy in all the simple things. I really took every aspect of life back to basics. And I'd like to share another listener story with you, because she had a very profound and life-changing experience from this book as well. And this story is from Meghan Morris, and her and I kind of bonded over this book. And when Kim and I decided we were doing this podcast, she came to mind immediately. So she said she read, or actually listened on Audible, Present Over Perfect, in the fall of 2017. And I think I probably read it maybe the year before that. But over the previous year, Meghan had added a lot of things to her plate. She says, "I had taken on the role as the PTA president, signed on as a chairperson for 2 big fundraising events at my daughter's school, and started a meal prep business. This was all in addition to my role as a stay-at-home mom and my 2 young daughters and husband. And I worked part-time in IT. I had a puppy and I was committed to my health and fitness goals at CrossFit. I really loved everything I was doing, and I didn't want to give anything up. I was doing a pretty good job at everything, except I was exhausted. I was gaining weight, and I would cook healthy, nutritious food for my clients and order pizza for dinner for my family. My business was going great, but I would get excited when my meal orders would be low because it freed up some time and energy. Present Over Perfect kept popping up as a recommended read in podcast I was listening to, so I suggested it for my book club. At this time, I was too tired to read a book, so I would listen on Audible on my cooking days. I remember listening to the book in the commercial kitchen I rented for my business, Fit Meals. I paused the recording and texted my husband, "Is Fit Meals making everyone miserable?" He didn't respond. That night I asked again, and he said, "But you really love it." And I said, "Got it." And my girls said similar things. I was tired and stressed, and as a result, I was not being the mom or wife I wanted to be. They were getting what was left over, and when I was done taking care of everything else. And I wanted them to be my priority again. I immediately started to plan my exit strategy. It was hard for me not to see closing my business as a failure, but my husband and girls were so happy about it. I knew it was the right thing to do. For Mother's Day, a few months later, my daughter, who was in second grade at the time, made a book for me where the kids were giving prompts to fill out each page. And she put, "I know my mom loves me because she closed her business to spend more time with me." If I had any doubts about my decision, that solidified that I had made the correct decision. So where am I now? I am a month away from being done with my present commitment, still volunteering at the school as much as I can. My family life is less stressful and more happy, and I'm healthier and stronger than I have ever been at 39 years old. And I was able to channel my passion for nutrition and food as medicine into a new venture as a nutrition coach. I'm loving my new role. I'm the happiest. I feel like I am really making an impact, and I'm sure you are, Meghan, but not at the detriment of my family's happiness. I always say I am happiest when I'm busy, but I am more mindful about where I commit my time and energy now. I don't know where I found this quote, but I keep it on my phone where I have my to-do list. You can do anything, but you can't do everything. Isn't that the truth? So true. And I know so many of us can relate to this. And no matter what your form of busy and frantic looks like, may it be a job or too many kids activities or too many volunteer activities or too many home projects or just too much stuff in general. As some examples, everyone in this world today can benefit from a little more silence and stillness. It's in these moments that we allow ourselves to appreciate all we have. Like, how do we do that though? Like, it sounds so good in theory, but in reality, how do we even start down this path? And we truly do have way more control than we think. So, there is something I want to read directly from the book, and It's kind of going back to the author and some of her friends and a conversation they were having. And I swear I've had probably the same conversation a million times with my friends. So it just really really stuck in my mind. So just to paint the scene, I guess she's sitting around the pool with some of her girlfriends, and they're talking about how they're just, they would like to get together more, but, everyone's just so busy. And then they say, kids, in school and work is insane, and piano and hockey and in-laws and baby showers and moving houses and book club, and who has time? And then someone buttoned up the conversation the same way we always do. But what are you going to do? We murmured in agreement, sipped our lemonade, dangled our legs in the cool water, reminded our kids not to run near the pool. On the way home, I couldn't help but think about that conversation, and in particular, that phrase. But what are you going to do? There we were, women in our 30s, educated, married, mothers, women who have careers, who manage homes and oversee companies. And there we were, utterly resigned to lives that feel overly busy and pressurized, disconnected, and exhausted. But that's shifting the blame, right? Who's the boss, if not us? Who's forcing us to live this way? Or possibly, do we not want to face the answer to that question? Preferably to believe that we can't possibly be held responsible for what we've done. And I loved that. It really, really stuck out to me because I know I created so much of my miserableness all by myself, just trying to live up to the standards of, the perfect mom today. So, we really need to take a step back and look at kind of why we're doing things. And, a couple things that I'm going to highlight that go, the book goes into depth, really talking about these different topics and really kind of guiding you on how to do this, how to take back control of your life. So, one of the things that stood out to me is just getting very clear on your priorities. And then once you do that, once you're clear on your priorities, you got to start saying no. You got to say no to the things that are not serving your highest priorities. And then here's the other thing. You got to do it without apologizing. And that is hard for us as women. We apologize and we feel so bad about it that we can't even get our point across. People don't even know what we're trying to say because we're so busy apologizing for it. And I know there's a whole nother book coming out. I think it just came out, Girl, Stop Apologizing. Yeah, I love the Girl Wash Your Face. So I'm sure that's a really great book as well. But yeah, that's something we all need to work on. So the book talks about, Present Never Perfect, talks about, the season of no. You have a season of no so that you can create space for the most important yeses. And, just a little personal story. I do help out with my daughter's youth group because that was an important yes for me. It was one of those things when I created all my space, that was something I added back in because I thought it would be, important to do with her. And I have to say, the messages that are taught to these teenagers in this youth group always resonate with me. And one that really, really stuck with me was a video they were watching, and there was a boy who was walking down the beach and he was carrying all these broken shells and picking up all these broken shells as he went. And when he got, to a certain point in the beach, I think in the video it was a starfish, but I always say it was like the big, perfect, shiny shell. And his hands were so full of all the broken shells that he could not pick up this most important, most special shell. And the point was, for the kids to really figure out, what their passions were and what's important to them. Because, for teenagers these days, there's so much you can get involved in. And, you want to be good at everything and you want to be doing everything. And really, in doing that, sometimes you spread yourself too thin. And this goes for our children, it goes for us. And, it was such a great story. And, the other thing with saying no, and there's a chapter about this, a whole chapter in the book about disappointing people. And the good news is that you get to decide who you're going to disappoint. You don't want to let it be the most important people to you, just to prove how capable you are on the outside, and you're out proving to the outside, and the people on the inside are being kind of left behind. And so, really take a hard look at that, because you want to make sure that as you're saying no, again, the things you're saying yes to are in line with your priorities. And then the third thing, and this maybe sounds too big picture, but it's really important to find your purpose. And maybe if that is too big picture for you right now, and that's just too cliche, which I absolutely get, I would say probably more specifically, just finding your joy and what brings you happiness. And once you have, in step 2, said no and created all this space, then in step 3, when you're finding your joy and finding your purpose, you start to fill the space with the things that, the space that you created, you fill it with the things that you love and that make you happy. And you build your life around your priorities that you identified in step 1. So I think that's, just summing up some of my takeaways from the book and just different things I learned at IIN, and, just hopefully giving a little guidance on where to even start with this. And Present Over Perfect has a video series, which I think would be really fun to like get a group of friends together and do it together. And with that video series comes a study guide. And, I don't have the video series. I just read the book, but I did purchase the study guide, and I really think it could be helpful as you're working through some of these things I just discussed, because it gives you, questions and prompts and, helps you take a deep dive and see things more clearly. Now, that being said, if you're a person who can sit down with, a blank journal and a pen, and that was me when I originally read the book. I did not have the study guide at that point. But if you're a person who can sit down, blank paper and pen and just these concepts and just go for it, then I highly recommend doing that. But if you feel like you need a little prompting and you don't know where to start, I think the study guide is a good, solid purchase, for that. And, this deep inner work here is kind of, if you listen to the wine episode that we did, I do talk about deep inner work, and this is it. This right here, this is the stuff I'm talking about. So, you can eat kale all day long, but if all is not well with your soul, you will never be whole and truly happy. So it's important to just stop and take some time to think about these things. And, I've read this book a few times. Again, back when I was living such a frantic life was the first time I read it. And that was my biggest takeaway. And I think that's probably what I've addressed mostly here so far, is more like the frantic side of things and how to get out of the crazy a little bit and start to have a, simpler, quieter life. But there's also a whole nother aspect of this book, and it is more about, soulful living. And when we quiet the noise and we can hear our inner voice and we can connect with God and connect with other people, truly connect with other people. So, there's a lot of good stuff in this book about that as well. And, recently, as I was reading it, now that I have Kim in my life, I was a whole nother perspective, thinking about her and how she's, taking this book and what's resonating with her, because again, we've talked about in earlier episodes, we're in totally different phases of life. Like Kim is in a, chaos is inherent when you have young kids, and there's an element of frantic that you can't do anything about. But when your kids get older, we do have a little more control. Some of our frantic is being created by the choices that we're making for ourselves and for our children. So, it's kind of taking a look at that, but it is going to be really interesting to kind of listen to Kim's perspective and her takeaways from this book, because we are at different points, and I know our listeners are at different points as well. So here's Kim.
Yeah, I'm here. Laurie's right. So this book was beneficial for me on a couple different levels. As she mentioned, I have little boys at home, and they are almost 4 and 5, and it is kind of a frantic time, because they are at home most of the time. They go to preschool, but it's not something that I can escape, and nor should I, really want to do that. But it's not a frantic that I've created, unless you consider that I created the boys.
You created these children?
I created these monsters. No, I love them. But yeah, so there is a level of, living a frantic life. However, I am a stay-at-home mom primarily. I was a nurse, and as you know, and also a teacher. And after my second son was born, I resigned to stay home with them. So I did take that element of the frantic pace out of my life. And so this is just kind of another stage in our life. But I think for me, this book felt really like a homecoming of some sorts, because she does mention the soulful aspect. And interestingly, the author, Shauna, her father was a minister, and she's very active in her church and talks about that throughout the book. And that really resonated with me. I think maybe I have mentioned it on other episodes, but my father is a Lutheran bishop. He was a pastor of a church, and I literally lived in the church parsonage. And we were at the church all the time, every weekend and often during the week too for various activities. I was in choir and a handbell choir, and they had something called like a weekday church school. And so I really resonated with that part. And I think God has always been central in my life, but I think also sometimes because of the franticness of our life, no matter where that's coming from, it can easily take a back burner unless you're very conscientious about incorporating God into your life. And so this really helped bring that front and center for me again. And so like Laurie said, our take on it was just a little bit different, although the same. And she's so sweet that she's always thinking of other people. And for her to even, think that maybe we saw this from different angles was, so thoughtful of Laurie. But what I wanted to share, and I am, I'm such a nerd when it comes to books. I, highlighted so much that it was so overwhelming. I told Laurie I typed up all of my notes, of the highlighted notes, and it was like 8 pages long. And so I condensed it to 2 pages of some points that really stood out for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some quotes or kind of paraphrase quotes from her chapters and just my takeaway. And these are just from a couple different chapters because I think it helps to explain where I'm coming from and some of the key points that I took away. So from the chapter on disappointing people, she talks about that you need a sense of God's deep, unconditional love and a strong sense of your own purpose. And with this, I'm being asked, and she says to ask yourself, will this thing I'm being asked to do get me more love? And if it's a no, then it's something that you probably don't need to be having in your life. She talks in this chapter about concentric circles of people in your life, so that your family is that inner ring, and then maybe the next one out is like your extended family. The next one might be coworkers or people that you see on a regular basis, and so on and so forth, out to the outer rings where are people you just maybe even just see on the streets or run into, but you're not, they're not really a part of your life. And so she talks about making sure that you're nurturing that inner circle first, those people who are central to your life. So my takeaway from that was that, which is kind of interesting, I think in this age of social media, I've been very present on social media. I do enjoy it to an extent, but it's also trying to grow an audience just for our podcast, for my own Instagram page, trying to interact with people online. And some connections I've made, I will say, on Instagram have been beautiful. And I've met some really nice friends that I may or may not ever meet in person, but I've really enjoyed those connections. However, sometimes I'm on there a lot of times scrolling. And I'm sure, if you have a smartphone, then you're doing the same thing. If you're on Instagram at all, you know what I mean by getting just so wrapped up in it. So I think that at times I've gotten so wrapped up in spending way too much time on social media. And that's really one of those outer rings. Like I said, I have formulated some friendships, but I think by and large, these are just people that you like their photo, or you maybe leave a comment, but you don't really know the person. But the problem is that's taking away time from my family. And I hate the thought of my boys just seeing the top of my head because I'm always staring down at my phone. And sometimes they'll come beside me and, who's that kid you're looking at? And I think, I don't even know that kid. He's just on Instagram, but they're interested, to know. And I'm thinking, why am I even looking at this sometimes, especially when my kids are around? So that was one takeaway. It's just that's really not that important in the overall scheme of life. And that doesn't really give me love. God's love is the only love that truly matters, I think, in this world. And that is one that's not earned. So, when you're on social media and you're trying to, like I said, grow an audience, if you are somebody who's an entrepreneur trying to build a business, you know what I mean by that. But that's not going to give you love, ultimately. And then from her chapter called Tunnels, she talks about the hustling that was an effort to outrun the emptiness and deep insecurity inside of her. She said, I return to the silence to return to love. The longer I practice deeply dwelling in God's love, the more present I feel, instead of being hijacked 1,000 times a day by my wild mind. I really resonated with that too. When I first became a stay-at-home mom, it's weird, but I felt empty. And I loved my sons very much, but I didn't know what to do with myself. And I've mentioned on other podcasts before that I was an older mom. I had my sons at 38 and 40, so I had worked my whole life up until that point, and I really wasn't sure what to do with myself exactly. And I also felt fiercely inadequate. So I did escape by writing, and I actually wrote a whole book. And again, I did that in bits and spurts, and while the boys were sleeping or maybe eating lunch, and I'm standing at the kitchen island. And I am proud of the work that I did, but I do think to an extent it was a sacrifice of the time spent with my babies. And, that's a painful truth, but it's something that, because it is a truth, I can learn from it and grow from it and not repeat those same mistakes. But also what resonated with me in this chapter is that my mind gets me into trouble. She's talking about her mind being hijacked. I feel like I'm always thinking of doing the next thing, or I create the worst case scenarios in my mind. And part of that's the anxiety that I have. But just knowing that and choosing not to let your mind hijack you is a choice. And the way you can get around that is by stopping, returning to that silence. And for me, prayer and daily devotions have helped immensely. And if I can do those devotions before my kids wake up, it really helps to ground me and kind of set the tone for my whole day. She does have a chapter called Present Over Perfect as well. And in it, she talks about the mess that she's living in is actually her life. That present is choosing to believe that your own life is worth investing deeply in instead of waiting for some rare miracle or fairy tale. Present means we understand that the here and now is sacred, sacramental, threaded through divinity, even in its plainness. And wow, I love those words, the sacred, sacramental, because again, it brings me back to church and to God. And my takeaways were, the mess that she's talking about. I feel like I live in a mess. My house is scattered in toys all the time, and I do my best to pick up, but it's like a mess 24/7. So, but my takeaway was that I don't have to have the most beautiful house, or I don't have to have the best life. And I also don't have to be happy all the time. I think, that's something that we see on social media. Everyone's posting, their happiest faces and their beautiful family photos when everyone's looking at the camera and everyone looks perfect in their cute little outfits. But that's not really reality. And, we do have problems in our lives. And I think admitting that is helpful, not only, to yourself, but to others. We have behavior situations in my house. My youngest is having a hard time being 3 right now. But I think my takeaway from this is that we do learn in our messes and we grow from them. So if we can look for silver linings and try to find the good in that, it's really important to do that. And as I mentioned, I'm also a sucker for all things sacred and divine, having come from a church-based background. And so returning to Christ is important to me. And I love the challenge of trying to find the divine in the here and now. I used to go to a church camp every summer, a lot of summers growing up, and worked at one also. And one thing I remember was that we would do an exercise to look for God sightings. And so those were things, times when we would see God at work in our average day. So, maybe at camp we would see things in nature, like the miraculous blossoms on trees or flowers growing in the middle of the forest. But it can also be things like when people are spreading God's love through their actions. So just, I guess looking for the good in people, and, you hear about random acts of kindness. So that kind of thing is God at work in our daily lives. And for that, I also like the idea of daily journaling and just kind of trying to look for those times in your day that are positive, that you can actually see God at work, and writing those down.
because then you can always flip back to that and say, I thought it was a pretty bad day, but there were some good points that I can reflect on. There are 2 chapters, Good Fruit and Emmanuel. They're around the same part in the book. But she talks about knowing when to stop. And she also talks about how she wants her work to be for him, meaning God, for him and with him. And she talks about Christ sitting next to me bodily, keeping me company. And I personally just love the idea of doing everything in my life for Jesus and performing in a way that is pleasing to him. So not only just with my work, so, whether it's this podcast or the things that I write about, in my blog or on social media, but also the way that I parent, and just thinking that I want to do that in a loving way that would be pleasing to God. So I also love the idea that Christ sits with me, even during my worst days. I think that is certainly so therapeutic for me. On the chapter on snow, she talks about, I love this so much, do the thing that you love to do, that God created you to do. So if Laurie talked earlier about finding your purpose, and sometimes it's hard to know what your purpose is. Sometimes our minds get very cluttered. This is what I went to school for, and I'm trapped in this job. And of course, we're not suggesting that you can just quit your job, because a lot of people can't, and you're reliant on your that income. But even if it's not your work, even if it's just a hobby or something, but finding that thing that you love to do, and just asking yourself, what are the things that you do effortlessly and easily? Those are God's calling on your life. So for me, I know I'm out of alignment when I try to make something work. If it doesn't quite feel right, I know that that's probably not what God's calling me to do. I spent years of doing things and jobs that didn't really resonate with me. I think and maybe this is the case for a lot of people, but there were times that I loved the work that I was doing, and then there were times that I knew I needed to be done with it. And so you probably understand that too. And again, you may not be able to leave your job, but there may be things that you can incorporate into your life that you really enjoy. So now for me, writing about health, speaking about cancer prevention, doing this podcast, all of those things are such a joyful experience. They're relatively effortless because I love doing them, and I really feel like this is my calling right now. And who's to say, that might change down the road, but I know for me right now, this is what I'm being called to do. And then finally, bring in the love. I think maybe the last chapter. She talks about how love is found in silence. It's in the sacred, risky act of being exactly who you are, nothing more, nothing less. In that still, holy space is the very spirit of God himself. Be present in both the mess and in the delight, and we'll find our way home. So for me, getting quiet is very important. And that means, kind of getting away from the noise within my head as well as the external surroundings. But retreating to nature, going for a long walk is very therapeutic, and doing so without distraction. So if I can, because I do like to listen to podcasts when I walk, but then I'm not really concentrating on, listening for the Holy Spirit in my life. So if I can do that without distraction, then I can also, kind of pray at the same time. I think really listening for the Holy Spirit to whisper allows me to hear what I'm being called to do. So again, those are my takeaways just from that sort of spiritual side. And so whether in your life, if you feel like you're kind of more on that frantic side, just trying to juggle everything in your life, this book is very powerful. And even if you have read it, like Laurie said, that she's read it multiple times, it's worth going back to. And I think, I love a good highlighter, going through and just highlighting the things that resonate with you so that you can always flip back to it. And if you are seeking that kind of spiritual side, this is a great book for that as well. But you don't have to be. If you're not a religious person or a spiritual person, there are still so many very tangible takeaways from the book. So we hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or suggestions.
You can always email us at contact@awholenewyoupodcast.com. If you'd like more from Kim, you can go to kimmaravich.com. For more from Laurie, go to simplympoweredllc.com. We'd also love it if you joined our Facebook community and followed us on Instagram. You can search for A Whole New You Podcast. And if you would be so kind as to leave us a review in iTunes, we'd really appreciate it so that more people can find our show and join our community. We'll see you next week.